All right, so the next shapes we're going to measure and draw are defined by the structure of the zygomatic bones or the zygomatic arch. Now, as I said in the PowerPoint, those zygomatic bones really help at the skeletal level establish the width of the face. The very widest part of that whole facial shape occurs at the lateral edges or furthest widths of the zygomatic bone or your cheekbone. But as we just chatted about in the PowerPoint, that zygomatic bone is so much more than your cheekbone. For one, as it moves towards its medial edges, it comes and it meets the projections of the maxilla, which are these, they sort of join as bones, but they're these two kind of arms that pull up from the bone that holds your top set of teeth and reach up to either side of the nasal bone to establish the inside lower edge of the eye socket. So those are the edges of the maxilla, which then join to the zygomatic bone, which then establish the lower limit of the eye socket and the lateral edges or outside edges of the eye socket as they reach up towards the frontal bone or the forehead. All right. They also, though, they have projections that help attachment points for the muscles and the fat in your cheek. And so that projects out to kind of fill out into these round shapes of the cheek. And then also sits just below skin level as it moves towards the ear to define what we would call the cheekbone. So if someone says they have one has high cheekbones, you'll see that is the lateral planes of the zygomatic bone projecting out and catching a whole lot of light. All right, you can really see that they're projecting shapes on Justin Bieber because the eye socket, being a socket, recedes, so we get a darker shadowy shape. And then the zygomatic bones project to become, to really sort of help us see the bright kind of apples of the cheek and also kind of high planes that lead us back to the cartilage of the ear, in particular the tragus, which is that little protective piece of cartilage that we just talked about in the PowerPoint. So since I already covered all of that, I'm not going to belabor it here. I'm just going to get to measuring. Measuring process is the same as we've been doing so far. Because these are somewhat bigger measurements, you might consider, instead of measuring all the way across this face, measuring just from center line out, and then kind of checking that measurement for symmetry on the other side. Sometimes it just stays a little bit easier to maintain the center of those measurements and verify that there isn't any asymmetry or head tilt. So that's just one suggestion. So let's go ahead and do that. So first what I'm going to do is over on Justin, I'm going to see if I can tell what the very widest point on his cheeks are. I'm going to go ahead and, mine isn't too large, so I'm going to go ahead and measure it straight across. So right edge is at the edge of the widest part of Justin's cheek, aligning with that tragus cartilage of the ear. I can tell it's the widest part because I can mark it from right to center to left side, and then I can lift that up and see that his hairline is moving inside of that measurement. If I pull it down, I can see that that jaw is moving far in from that width measurement. So there we go. We've defined it as that widest point apart from the cartilage of the ears. All right. So there I have the width. I'm going to mark a nice straight line, establishing that width, hopefully, on Justin. Oh, shoot. Here we go. Sorry, I thought I wasn't recording for a second. There's always got to be an awkward moment in my videos. Okay, so here's my width. I've established that horizontal to really help me find that height. And then I'm just going to use my nasal measurement because I have that established here to know exactly where that highest width is. This could be, as you get better at this, you can do more eyeballing. I'm just measuring super explicitly because, especially when you're just starting a facial process, having those notations let you take just one step back at any point. All right, so this is going to be the height of that cheek width. And then when I'm ready, I can take that entire span, drop it on the line I just drew. And that allows me to accurately establish the width of Justin's face at his cheek. Okay. What I'm going to do is I might just look for a few more sort of shapes that come off around the cheek just to help me define where to place my light and shadow a little bit. So I look for hard shapes and soft shapes that help me define the structure and volume of the cheek. So the first thing I'm going to do is I already have my nose well drawn, so I'm going to look for the shapes that come directly off the nose. So I see these two kind of softer folds that help transition from nose to cheek down to lip. So I'm going to just kind of start establishing that. If I look kind of off the nose and the eyes, I kind of get a shape sort of like that. I can see that the brightest places on Justin's cheeks don't travel to the very edge of the head. Once I get the whole face in here, I'll probably come back and establish this more. But just so that face doesn't start looking too wide and look strange to me before I get the rest of it in, I am going to use a little bit of measuring and value to establish the bright front planes of Justin's cheeks and to start suggesting that the facial shape itself moves from a relatively flat front-facing front plane and then quite strongly turns back towards the ear, which we see suggested by a value shift. Do you see what I mean there? So the edge of the light planes of the front of that projecting cheek shape, I'm defining about there and there. Different faces, that's going to be more or less obvious. You may not find every measurement that I'm finding on Justin on your celebrity or subject, whoever you decided. But you might find more. So just sort of look for any value shifts that help you kind of suggest shifts in plane from light to shadow, from projecting plane to receding plane. Mark those positions and then drop them on your drawing as tick marks that you can then go back in with and define more as light and shadow. So I'm going to start claiming the apples of Justin's cheek. He's a very happy mugshot. All right, and so that's kind of my brightest part. Now I'm seeing shadow planes that come off as the zygomatic bone pulls back towards the ear. So I'm going to establish that structure and start pulling it through. Also, what's something, an even more obvious light and shadow shift that I'll refine more as we move up the face in a few minutes. But I'll just sort of suggest here, so I'm gonna look for the shadow shapes that are defining the bottom edge of the eye socket, which is the top edge of the zygomatic bone. So I'm just gonna do a couple height lines to help me say, okay, the top of the zygomatic bone relates to that bottom edge of the eye socket. I'm gonna measure that from the base of the nose. Oh, I kind of already have it. It's just a little bit higher. Start suggesting a little bit of shadow in there. All right, I might go ahead and measure where we have that sort of widest point of the eye socket, which is going to correspond pretty closely with the corner of the eye. So I'm going to mark that. So horizontal first. Measure from base of nose up to that height. It's pretty close to that narrowest point of Justin's nose. I already had a line there. And then along that line, I'll measure a width, which interestingly enough is pretty much aligned with the measurement I made. Kind of for the limits of the apples of the cheeks. Maybe it's just inside of that. So you can see how we're really, at moments, kind of establishing it as structure. That looks like it relates. Something more like a skeletal socket. We'll stick an eye in there in a minute. All right. Now that I have some of that structure, I can just use value, directional mark making. There we go. To establish those zygomatic shapes.